wherever you're joining us from, and welcome to session 12 of the Academia 2063 Ukraine Crisis webinar series. I am Layi Butake, Director of Communication Outreach for Academia 2063. Always a delight, always a pleasure and honor to welcome you to these weekly sessions. You recall we launched the Academia 2063 Ukraine Crisis webinar series in November 2022. And during these sessions, we discuss, we unpack the socioeconomic ramifications of the Russia-Ukraine war on African economies. And it's always a delight to have you join these sessions to share your insights, your inputs, as we try to come up with policy options to help African countries better withstand such crises and shocks. During this session today, we are going to be discussing the impacts of the crisis on commodity markets in Mozambique. And this is based on Ukraine Crisis Brief 15, authored by Dr. Greenwell Machaya. We are looking forward, as always, to a highly engaging and interactive conversation with you all. Please go to the chat, tell us your name, tell us the organization you represent, and what you hope to see today. Tell us if you have been reading our Ukraine crisis briefs and which briefs you have downloaded the most. And of course, as far as this conversation is concerned, we want to hear your inputs. We want to have your contributions. Please go to the Q&A and drop any contributions, any questions, any observations in the Q&A so that they can be brought to the floor during the conversation. And of course, you are welcome to raise your hand if you wish to intervene live as we go through this session. As always, we are providing simultaneous interpretation in English and French. If you need translation, kindly click interpretation on your screen and choose the language track of your choice. And we are also live streaming on our YouTube channel, Academia 2063. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, please permit me welcome our moderator for today's session. He is Academia 2063's Director of the Department of Operational Support, Dr. Getao Tadase.
Thank you, Dr. Live. Thank you for your introduction. And welcome, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where we are. And thank you for joining us. Today, we'll be discussing about the Ukraine crisis and its impact on commodity markets in Mozambique. That will be presented by Dr. Greenwell Machaya. He is a senior international researcher at International Water Management Institute, and he's also a coordinator for the regional, the RISAC's regional analysis, strategic analysis and support program for Eastern and Southern African regions. So he will be presenting on his findings on how the Ukraine crisis has impacted the commodity markets in Mozambique with some price data and all these things. So with this little introduction, I wish him good success for his presentation. And I want to invite him for his presentation. And Dr. Greenwell, you have 20 minutes for presentation, and then we will have Q&A sessions. And I encourage everybody to participate in this discussion. And you can also put your questions in our chat room, and then we can raise those issues during our Q&A sessions. Over to you, Greenwell.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gitata Desi, as well as Dr. Lai Butake, for giving me this opportunity to present at this series. Let me just share my screen. I hope you can see that. Yeah, so as already introduced, the topic is on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and we're looking at the impacts on commodity markets in Mozambique. The presentation is arranged according to this outline, so I'll have some kind of an introduction. Then after that, we'll talk about objectives, then the methods that we've used to come up with the brief, as well as the results and some key messages. So As you already know, I mean, the countries in the world have a lot of interconnectedness. So they're connected to each other in ways that are, in some cases, so advanced, either through politics or business or road infrastructure, culture, etc., languages as well. And all these imply that if one country experiences some shock, that shock is likely going to be transmitted to other countries because of those interlinkages. So the Russia and Ukraine countries which are fighting, we also know that these are kind of key exporters of agricultural commodities as well as inputs, fuels, etc. So whatever happens to them is likely going to be felt by other countries also. Which trade, for example, global wheat trade, and 23% as well as 14% of barley as well as maize trade respectively. We know also they trade a lot in phosphorus as well as other minerals that are important for agricultural production as well as for other industries. So we think that the effects of the Russia-Ukraine war might be felt in different countries through a number of ways. Firstly, obviously, if a country that is trading with Russia or Ukraine, and because of the war, maybe they're no longer sending their commodities to you, you're going to be directly impacted because of that. So the supply is going to become low for the things that you buy from them. If you also send commodities to them, to Ukraine, you can't easily trade with them. So you're also going to be impacted. So your commodity, which depending on whether you're a net supplier or a net consumer of that commodity, you're still going to be kind of impacted. But secondly, even if you don't trade directly with them, you might be indirectly affected if you trade with countries that trade directly with them. So if countries, in most cases, do import goods, in some cases, they import more than they need because they want to export the others to other countries. So take an example of fertilizer or wheat. Countries would import from Russia and import more than they need, export the others for a fee to the other countries. So those countries would also be affected because of the war indirectly. But again, thirdly, you might find that for some countries might just decide that, okay, we don't, even if they don't trade with Russia or the other countries that trade with Russia, they would want to just keep their stocks of several commodities because they are worried about the future expectation of, they have a negative expectation of the market in future for different commodities. So they might just want to hoard whatever they have. That would also lead to an impact on prices of commodities. And again, the increasing fuel prices, transport costs, and other transaction costs in general mean that it becomes difficult now to move things, commodities from one place to another. And because of that, countries that are near or distant from Russia and Ukraine will still be affected because of that. So in general, the Russia-Ukraine war, as we know, has destabilized markets, global markets, for many value chains, and this might worsen the harder and longer the war is fought. So what we're saying is that it would be useful to be having kind of timely and localized studies in order to just understand what is happening in different locations. This table serves as some evidence that in the first months of the war, prices for various commodities, including crude oil, gas, maize, rice, wheat, beef, sugar, and sunflower, changed at various degrees. So, for example, sunflower, wheat, and crude oil respectively changed by more than 30% over those months, whereas maize and liquefied gas also changed by greater than 12%. So these are changes in prices on the global market, meaning that if those changes are there, it's also chances are higher that the other markets outside within countries would also see the same kind of, a similar kind of change. So the specific then objectives are, we wanted to analyze price trends within those first 4 months of the war for selected commodities from local markets within Mozambique, and draw some insights that may be useful for limiting the impacts of the crisis on livelihoods. We're not necessarily going to be talking about other impacts beyond the price impacts, but we know that also through the prices, then you have a lot of other effects that are going to follow. But I think that is also being covered in other studies, for example, the ones being done by Ismail, etc. And to do the study, we used data from Mozambique's market information systems as obtained by, from the Mozambique colleagues or government, as well as some data from the World Bank. They conducted estimates of what was going to be the impact of various things. So for those prices, we have used them to construct some of the tables. And then we did perform analysis of changes over time in terms of those price changes. And then later we also have supplemented that with some kind of a look at the seasonal adjusted ARIMA models, just to see whether what we're seeing from the data using trends can also be substantiated if you use some other econometric analysis. So that's what we're going to show. But I have to say that at the time of writing this brief, we did not have enough data to permit analysis using the other methods that I'm going to show later, that we're also trying to use them. And I think going forward, we'll be using some of them to inform us even more about what is happening. So this one is limited to looking at the price trends for the first 4 months using weekly data, and then we start trying to draw conclusions based on that. This graph is showing domestic and international wheat prices for between January and May 2022. So this graph here shows wheat flour in Tete. Tete is a rural kind of a district, or this is a rural market in Tete. And this one shows wheat flour in Ihambane, which is an urban kind of district within Mozambique. And the bottom one, these are like international prices for wheat. Now, we say Mozambique is kind of relies on imports to meet the demand for wheat. It doesn't produce enough wheat of its own, and 40% of wheat is sourced from Russia and Ukraine. So we do expect already there that there might be a direct impact on prices in Mozambique once the war has started, because they rely, after all, to the extent of 40% on imports from those two countries. So yes, wheat flour prices increased between April and May. So the price effect of supply reduction appears to have been larger than the price effect of demand reduction, obviously. So because when the war is being fought, you're expecting two things, as I said. So the first part is that there is going to be a reduction in supply of wheat from Russia. Already that puts prices upwards, because you have to scramble for too little on the international market if you're a net importer. But at the same time, as the war is fought, you might find that the impacts of thereof are going to lead to job losses, income losses, etc. And then maybe you might think that prices might go down because of that. However, the net effect here is that the prices went up because the supply effect was kind of the response of prices to the supply fall was higher. And combined, you saw that there was around 30% increase in prices in markets of Tete and Ihambane, but this increase is also similar to the one that we record on the international market, which was about 36% over that period. And the increase was more in rural Tete than in urban Ihambane, likely because wheat is generally imported in Mozambique. And when you import things, usually they come towards your urban centers first, and then they're distributed to other places in rural areas. So the transaction costs of distributing to rural areas might be the reason why the prices were high and more volatile in the rural areas. Again, when you look at sugar prices, you find that sugar price, Mozambique is a net sugar exporter, so it produces its own sugar. But sugar prices were stable before the crisis, you can see, but after the crisis, started seeing sugar prices rising. And sugar prices were normally lower in urban centers than in rural markets, and they continued to be so even during the crisis. But I think what you see is that the average price increase in Maputo was just about 7%, but Maputo is an urban market, but the price increase in rural Tete was about 11%. So there was this increase, we can say it was kind of comparable also to the increase on the world market. It was just 6.8%. So it is also possible that therefore the global scarcity in sugar led to an increase in prices in Mozambique. But you can see that the increase is not as much as wheat, it's just a modest increase, which is also similar to the increase on the international international market. Well, when you come to rice, Mozambique imports rice from different countries, including the neighboring countries, Malawi, etc. Before the war, we see that rice in Tete was the prices for rice in the rural areas were was higher than the price in the urban centers. But later in April, we see that the prices they switched places here, with the urban ones rising more than the rural ones. So here, I do not have like a very specific explanation, except to say that it would appear that the rural, because of maybe supply difficulties in the rural areas, that's why we're seeing the differences in prices across time. So with the rural areas experiencing higher prices than the urban centers. But then the increase probably in the urban centers of this price might be due to the fact that later, as the war was fought longer, then there was hold on. Yeah, as there's someone speaking near me. Yeah, so I think that the increase in urban prices could reflect that the scarcity created by the war was taking further effect for import-dependent urban centers. This graph shows the price for, okay, this is wrongly named, but it's for red meat. So the red meat, you see that in Maputo, which is the urban center, the prices are always higher than in Tete, which is a rural market. And there's also not much change in the rural areas, but there's some kind of a reduction in prices in the rural centers. We can argue whether we should expect really some kind of an effect on the meat market here, red meat market, because I think most of the meat in Mozambique is kind of sourced within the country. Much less of it is sourced outside the country, in which case I didn't expect a lot of change here. However, I'm saying that the generally higher urban beef prices than the rural prices due to high incomes and import dependency in the urban centers, but the decline in prices may reflect declining urban demand, probably as incomes plummeted due to the war effects, because the war led to a lot of disturbance. Many prices went up, even if the price of beef might not have directly gone up, but the people now are going to suffer through the income constraint, through incomes, because they have a fixed income or maybe even declining income. So that probably might explain why the prices were going down over in May and in March and in April. Cooking oil prices here, we see that the cooking oil prices in Marapura, which is a rural market, seem to have kind of increased substantially than the cooking oil prices in the urban market of Ihambane. Most of these cooking oils are kind of imported from outside. And we know already that Russia and Ukraine play a critical role in a vegetable oil trade and sunflower trade, and which means that some of these changes might be related to the effects of the war. And especially now, if you also consider that in rural Marapula, cooking oil prices rose by about 40% over the period considered, whereby in the urban center of Ihambane, it was just about 7%, but still a positive change. So the switch here may imply that cooking oil became more scarce in rural markets as urban demand increased, and maybe because taking advantage of the high incomes in the urban centers, most of these scarce cooking oil that was there was monopolized in the urban centers, leading to an increase in prices in the rural areas. So the increase in oil prices and in cooking oil prices in the market, in both markets, might be explained primarily by the effect of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. If you also take a look at the energy prices, you see that there was kind of, before the war, there was stability in the prices. But after the war, the prices started kind of rising. So this is the price of diesel, the price of petrol, the price of cooking gas. I've just taken one market there and to just show the kind of level of prices, but that's also because for some of the markets that we have, I think there is not much difference between one market to the other when you take one commodity. So if you take petrol, prices seem to be almost similar, maybe because they're subsidized and also they are set by a regulator. But if you compare between them, you see that over time, the prices are kind of increasing. So Mozambique, here what I'm also trying to say is that energy prices increased in line with world market prices. But Mozambique currently is becoming a significant energy exporter. So this increase might, depending on how the revenues are used for some of this, might actually mean something else. It might mean that they could use some of the money they get from sales of energy to other countries for economic development within the country, depending on how they use them. So Mozambique is a net exporter of energy to countries in the Southern Africa power pool, with South Africa as one of the largest energy importers from there. So the final effect of price increase may depend on what Mozambique does with the, I'm just calling it the energy bonanza, because the more the prices go up for energy, if you're an energy exporter, you're going to gain something from there. So whether that is going to help the other households, it depends on your income distribution policies. This is the summary of the markets and how prices changed. So for maize, see that on the global market, there was a 23% change in prices. But in the local areas, local market of Marapura, it was just about 2.7%. In the urban market of Ihambane, almost no change. Wheat, 36% change on the international market, and about 45% change in rural areas, and about just 4% change in urban centers. Sugar, again, 6% change at the world market, about 7% change in rural areas, and 11% change in Ihambane, which is an urban market. For rice, at the international stage, 9.7% change, but in rural areas, 0 to negative change. We saw there was a declining trend. For cooking oil, the changes in Mozambique were about 26% to 34%, and at the international stage, they were about 51%. For beef, almost no change in the rural markets, and just about 9% change in the urban centers. But at the international stage, it was also just 1.9%. For fuel, at the international stage, crude oil increased, the price increased by about 30%. Yet in Mozambique, rural areas, petrol and diesel prices increased by between 19 to 26%, and also by between 19 to 27% in the local markets. And liquefied gas, natural gas, 12% increase at the international stage, but just about 11.2% in rural Mozambique, as well as 8.4% change in local urban centers. Now, the point of showing this and comparing them is that we should see clearly that what was happening on the international stage appears to also be happening to some degree in the country, in local markets, as well as in the urban markets. The exception is just with rice and the maize prices here. But I think for the rest, they seem to mimic what was happening on the international stage. If you, so here we try to look at the prices, the price changes in all the markets and see which prices seem to be increasing and which prices seem to be declining. If you compare them, if you graph them and compare them, you see that in both rural and the urban centers, prices of commodities generally increased, but prices of all commodities in the rural markets generally increased more, with the exception of rice and red meat, as I said. So these are urban markets. If you sum all the markets, you find that about 70% of the markets were seeing price increases during that period of under study, where as compared to just about 63% for the urban markets. Rural areas of Mozambique appear to have been hit harder by the war in this case. So this might also be because costs of fuel led to restricted kind of or reduced rural supply. Now, if I wanted now to say, it's possible that some of the trends we're seeing might be just something that might be happening because of the nature of the year or the nature of the part of the year that we were in. But really, now that we have data for longer periods, we're able to see here, just try to kind of provide some graphs. These graphs are showing, they're showing some results of a SARIMA analysis. So using ARIMA to kind of predict what prices we would have expected had it been that, for example, with respect to the first one, this first one, if there was a COVID-19 only, so we parameterize the model to up to 2021 so that we take into account the COVID effects and predict the prices to see what they should have been. So that's this line. And then the other line is to say, okay, what if we say there was no COVID and there was also no Ukraine-Russia war? What kind of prices would we have expected? So you find this kind of prices in the middle. But this one, the blue line, is the actual prices that we're seeing in Mozambique. So using this, then you can start seeing that, okay, there's too much departure, a lot of departure between the observed prices and the prices that would have obtained if there was just the COVID issue. And the Ukraine war did not come. And again, if there was no Ukraine war and there was no COVID war, this would have been the line. The prices, so meaning that these prices are there because of all these combined effects of Ukraine war as well as the other war. Ukraine war as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. With that, then I can come to the key messages. So the key messages here are that the Russia-Ukraine war presents a challenge for global food security and household resilience. Through direct and indirect pathways, prices of commodities have been hit, and the magnitude depend on whether, depend on the kind of commodity we're talking about. And through scarcity created and the impacts on terms of trade of commodities, the Russia-Ukraine war affected prices for commodities in local markets within Mozambique. These impacts are not uniform, and the fuel shock induced food price changes in rural areas due to high transaction costs. But for some commodities, for example, rice, the impacts on incomes led to declining demand, and that's prices as well. For the design of appropriate interventions, understanding this kind of heterogeneous impacts of of the war on different commodities as well as urban versus rural is very important. Otherwise, you might end up prescribing something that does not obtain in that market or that location. And in respect of the results, therefore, it would be crucial to enhance social protection by developing and strengthening programs that support consumers and vulnerable households, providing safety nets where they are, depending on what you're seeing from analysis. So everything needs to some extent, rely on analytics rather than just guesswork. And we can learn also from the COVID, the way Mozambique approached the COVID pandemic. To some extent, I think they were successful. So looking ahead, it would be good to increase funding to agriculture in general, increase diversification of value chains, so that if one is hit hard, the other one can at least compensate. And it would also be good to generally enhance the agricultural sector with irrigation technology, agribusiness extension, etc. And because some of the resources, at least from what I've seen from the sugar prices, as well as the implication of the increasing energy prices for an energy exporter like Mozambique, the implication is that they're going to have money, but that money might only be localized to that sector, which is less labor intensive. So it might not, the benefits might not reach everyone else. So it would be good to ensure that the distribution policies are good, and so that money can move from that sector to the other sectors that are badly hit. Now, in the past, someone did ask in the previous presentation, someone did ask to whether the country is already doing something. Yes, for the case of Mozambique, we tend to see that the government is already reacting to the Russia-Ukraine war. So, for example, they have resolved to revitalize some schemes which used to produce wheat, and they want to produce more wheat, targeting Niassa province because of its potential. But also they have kind of removed some taxes on from organic seeds, insecticides, pesticides, fungicides, as well as machinery. And they have also reduced VAT for value-added tax from fertilizers. And within the livestock subsector, they are increasing production of mandatory vaccines for animals. They have also resorted to enhance national production of feed using locally sourced materials such as soybean and corn. And they are also about to continue to subsidize companies that produce fertile eggs for national production of one-day chicks. I think all these are an effort to try and build resilience of the sector, to make sure that even if there's war, as the war is fought, they shouldn't suffer much within the agriculture sector. So with that, over to you, Gita. That's the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Grewal, for your nice presentation. And yes, it's very good observations of different commodities, across commodities and all these things. I encourage panelists to raise your hand for asking questions, but before that, I will just have my own interventions. I think you looked at everything. I mean, from the price analysis, at least three things are very, very important. The first one is on price volatility. How volatile is the price trend, or the volatility itself? And second is the level itself, the price level. Is the price level increasing or changing positively or negatively? Those are the things that you looked at. And the other one, you also looked in some of the graphs, there are some structural breaks happening in the sense that prices were high at some point in the urban areas, and then immediately it reversed to the other way around. And then it becomes the rural becomes lower than the urbans, especially that's for rice, for example. And these are the three areas that are very much clear from your presentation. And from the volatility perspective, what I can see is at early, before, like in April, you looked at from January to up to May, And then during April, January, February, the price volatility was very high. This price were just moving, oscillating. But during May, and it's a little bit stabilizing. Does that mean that countries like Mozambique are adapting to the crisis? Because even if the price level is very high, if you look at in May for most of the commodities that you presented, and the curve is somehow smooth, that means the market is stabilizing. Does that mean that the country is adapting to the crisis? That's something that you may comment on that. And the other one is on the structural breaks for rice, especially for rice. You see that in May or around May, and the price for urban is become higher than the rural areas. Is that means that maybe probably local production is being encouraged, or they have started, the local producers are starting producing rice because the price is high, and then the supply chain is just reversed, like from urban to rural rather than from now changing from rural to urban? Is that the case? Probably, if there is a potential for rice production in Mozambique, I don't know the farming systems, or it might be because of the demand change, because the rural demand might be easier to change to other commodities than the urban demands. So the urban demand might have shifted because of the high price in rice to other commodities, and then the price become lower in the rural areas than the urban area. The urban demand might be a little bit more challenging to change because of the behavior of the consumers. And those might be some of the explanations that might help to explain why this structural breaks has happened. And generally, you will see also the case for the rural versus urban. The effect is more significant on rurals than the urban. That is the conclusion you have made. And can you explain a little bit about that also? Because you have explained already, but you might explain a little bit why the rural is more affected by the urban consumers, or probably for that matter in terms of prices. Yes. With this remark, I wait for the others to act. Please go ahead and comment on those issues.
Yeah, thanks very much, Gitao. Yes, so maybe let me start with the rural versus urban one. The way I'm interpreting this is that it is really because of the nature of the shocks that took place. So in the first place, the Russia-Ukraine war affected energy prices, so fuel prices, etc. Now, if a country is importing a lot of its stuff, most commodities, in most cases, these commodities, the destination that these commodities go to are urban centers first. And then from the urban centers, you start distributing them to retail markets and in rural areas. I'm thinking that in the presence of fuel problems, you might find that maybe that's the reason you're finding that the prices in the rural areas are now expensive, because the person who wants to transport it there has to add some kind of a markup just to make sure that it's profitable to supply the rural markets. So that's one of the reasons that I'm thinking that the impact seems to be higher on prices in the rural areas. It would have been different if the commodities were highly produced in the rural areas. Then we would have seen maybe some kind of an opposite effect there. When it comes to the rice, yes. So one of the things I think might be happening here is that rice compared to maize, rice is very important, but maize is extremely important in Mozambique. I think in rural areas, if you don't eat maize-based food, you might tend to say that I slept on an empty stomach, even though you ate rice. So if you find that rice is becoming expensive in the rural areas, you might just say, okay, it's expensive after all. Let us switch to something else. So you start buying the good that is relatively cheaper. In that case, maybe maize or another cereal. But whereas in the urban centers, these are areas whereby taking rice is taken as important. You cannot just easily switch. So maybe because of that kind of differential in tastes, and maybe I can still call it in kind of tastes and preferences, you might find that the two are adjusting differently at different levels. So I mean, at different speeds. The rural area might just give up, whereas in the urban centers, they might still want to have it. As a result, prices are going to go up, and you're going to see that switch. I wasn't really ready to embrace the thinking that probably it's because of new production. Yes, in rural areas, there's some production of wheat, I mean of rice, but I'm not sure whether that might have been the real reason. Because if it was the reason, I mean, if it's the case, maybe if I can look back at the data just to see, but I tend to think about the preferences as the reason rather than new supplies of rice coming in the rural areas. On adapting, yeah, that's a good proposition there. I've also seen that, yes, the volatility appears to kind of reduce as we go deeper, but the prices are rising. So it
Hello, am I freezing?
I think we lost Greenwell for a few seconds. Greenwell, can you hear us?
We lost Greenwell. Let us wait for some.
Gita,
Getel, you might want to
I lost
okay,
you.
he's back. We lost you for a few seconds, Greenwell.
Yes. Yeah, but that was the final I mean, did he? I don't know whether Gita heard me.
Yeah.
I mean, I was attempting to answer the stability question.
Yeah, I think you answered my questions. I think let us move to the next person for I see somebody wants to ask.
Yes, we have two hands raised, Getel.
But I cannot see their hands, but can you?
Okay. So
Yeah, can you invite them, please?
Okay, so the first hand we have is Richardson Kojo Edeme. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I want to ask on a quick note. Now the work. What is the relationship between the findings and intra-African trade, because that is also necessary in line with African trade agreement. And what are the policy implications as far as African intra-trade, as far as agricultural exports within Africa is concerned? That is my concern, so that they can also throw a light and maybe relate a study on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think in the brief, it's that intra-Africa trade part is as an implication is highlighted, but unfortunately I didn't talk about it here. But yeah, the implication is that even in this time where the prices are rising and other countries are trading less, we should still continue to encourage trade. Borders have to be open, because it's only if borders are open that we are going to minimize the impact of the shock on any one group of people. You find that if countries start closing borders and applying export bans, because they're so worried, like maybe the way India and is it Brazil did at the beginning of the war, we just hurt other countries even more, but even ourselves even more. So the implication for this is that it is better to have markets open rather than to impose export bans, because in some you actually achieve less by closing borders than opening them. We also learned about the same during the COVID era, and the analysis that are there in the briefs also, they kind of yield the same conclusions. Over to you.
Thank you, Greenwell. Yeah, I think, yeah, we'll come to with another question on similar line. But before that, Julie, I see your hand.
Thank you, Gitao. Thank you, Greenwell, for the really interesting presentation. And in speaking of impacts of COVID on prices, I do remember one very striking result from your COVID price impact analysis a few years ago was how different the impacts were in different countries depending on their position in regional trade. So countries that were regional exporters versus regional importers had really different impacts of COVID-19 on prices. And speaking again of COVID-19, I wanted to ask, I was curious in your slide that showed observed versus expected price trends. How was the COVID-19 only scenario constructed? What does that consist of? And if you could, I know it's not the main purpose of this presentation, but if you could quickly comment on why prices declined in Mozambique under that COVID-19 only scenario. I was wondering about that. Thank you.
Okay. I want to go back to the presentation. Okay, sure. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Okay, so
Yes,
I think you're talking about this, Julie. Yeah, so the first question is the first question is why did the prices go up under the COVID? So under the COVID scenario, and this is consistent with the brief that you're talking about as well. The in Mozambique in general, the prices because the country is still a country that produces a little bit of some of these commodities, but not as for wheat, it produces some wheat, but not as much. And I don't know whether I'm answering your question, but the reason the prices went down, it was really because of the fact that you closed the borders during under the COVID scenario. You've demand has gone down. As a result, there's nowhere to sell, so prices in general go down. I think that was consistent in Zimbabwe, markets of Zimbabwe, markets of Malawi, as well as markets of Mozambique. Whereas for the Ukraine crisis, it's a bit different. For the Ukraine crisis, the markets, the demand is not suppressed. What is suppressed is supply. So then the inclination is that the prices are going to go up, and indeed they are also going up. I don't know whether I'm answering your question, Julie.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I was also, I just wanted to ask though, if COVID-19 only scenario.
Okay, how it was constructed. So for the COVID-19 one, basically the construction here is depends on how you parameterize the model, the Sarima model. So for the COVID-19 one, you try to choose the years. So that's the assumption. Choose the years in such a way that whatever was happening about COVID, so the adjustments, due to COVID, the period that at least that took place, you can consider that to be 2020, the year of when we first saw cases of COVID, as well as 2021. So if you take 2020 and 2021, you include them in the price series, the history, the other years, together with the other years, to parameterize the model, then at least you can say that the effects of COVID are already in the model. So the prices that you have used to construct the model already take into account the effect of the COVID, of COVID-19. Okay, so then at least one wouldn't say that, okay, so maybe you're leaving the effect of COVID. The effect of COVID will already be in the parameters that form the model which you use to do the forecasting. Whereas for the no COVID, for this one, which I'm calling the normal, where you assume that there's no Russia-Ukraine crisis and there's no COVID. For this one, you should just parameterize the model by taking into account data that runs all the way from where it begins to 2019, because by that time there was no COVID and there was also no Russia-Ukraine crisis, and then you kind of focus the prices. So you take that as a no COVID and no Russia-Ukraine scenario. So this is how I constructed the no COVID one. I just kind of
But Greenwell, I mean, generally, I might have missed you because I was dropped for some time.
Okay.
The question is why the price is lower than the normal. I mean, for COVID scenario. I mean, we know that, I mean, the price effect of COVID-19 might be high for some countries, it might be low for the other countries. But in your case, I think because the green is lower than the red one, that means that COVID-19 has a price depressing effect.
Yes. That one I've already said.
What you observed, yeah.
Yes, that one, that's exactly the thing. COVID-19 suppresses demand as well as the prices go down. So I've already said that, but Julie was asking another question. I think she wanted to find out how I constructed the no COVID scenario.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure, Julie, whether my explanation is clear there.
Yes.
But, okay.
Yeah, thanks, Greenwell. And yes, I think when you were dropped, Gatau, Greenwell responded to the question on the decline.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, no problem. Thank you, guys.
Okay, any more additional questions? I can't see from the chat room.
There's another hand up, Antoinette Sala. The floor is yours.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Machaya, for your presentation. It was very informative. I've learned a lot of details. And also, just want to say well done for the policymakers in Mozambique. Now, you have produced a lot of information, Dr. Greenwell. How do you think that the policymakers will tackle or adopt your information? That's one question. The second question is about nutrition trends. Do you have any data on it versus, I mean, rice versus maize? What are the rural dwellers eating in the urban areas? And then just one thing that I've noticed on figure 4, the title, can you just look at the title? It doesn't really reflect the graph.
Yes,
4.
that's true. That's true. That's my bad. It talks about red meat, and I mean it's about red meat, but the title is something else. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. So on nutrition trends, you asking about so I do not have data on nutrition, but I bet my colleagues might have. But I didn't deal with data on nutrition specifically here. Do you mean by nutrition here? Do you mean?
I wanted to find out about who is eating what. Yes, thank you.
Okay. I think for this one I did not gather data for that one, but it definitely would be interesting to see, because that's also how we can know about the further ramifications of the price changes. In terms of policymakers and how they can access this, so the brief, since it was published, it has kind of been shared with some people in Mozambique. But I think and this meeting that we have here, we're also hoping that by disseminating it, we are letting them aware. But maybe at some point within the year, together we might. I'm not promising here, but I think we might have efforts where we aggregate work like this and other pieces of work that are being done focusing on Mozambique as well as other countries, and disseminate it to a wider public for the benefit of policymakers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any additional hand?
Yes.
If not,
yes,
I have one more.
We have one more hand.
Please, let me see. I cannot see.
Naila Magat.
Okay. Naila,
Hi,
please go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neila Manshati. I work for IFAD office in Maputo, Mozambique, and I previously worked in IFAD-funded project on the field called Procava. So thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to comment on the last question on nutrition. Even though information was not gathering, and I'm not giving any scientific information, but for my knowledge on the area, and as it was said, Mozambique in rural areas mainly, wheat is not one of the main, even though it's produced in a very small scale, it's not one of the main food staples in the household level. So people mainly rely on maize for consumption. So I don't think, but as I said, and I say again, it's not a scientific conclusion. I don't think this lower or increase in prices of wheat might affect nutrition, because even though people have access to very nutritive ingredients, they do not have much information about nutrition value, but a lot of projects and different partners for the government are investing now in nutrition trainings, culinary trainings to raise this awareness on nutrition. So if people are having nutritional issues, might be just because this is the figure and the government and partners are trying to address it. But I really doubt that this the variation in the price of wheat might have affected nutrition at the household levels. And the second aspect that I wanted to add is that through Procava, for example, I am not aware of other projects that are doing that, but at least through Procava, IFAD is supporting the government in terms of introducing higher scales of production of cassava as a replace source for people to replace with flour for bread, for example. And it would be good, and supporting production as well as production of certified seeds, and then legislation as well. And it might be also helpful to mention that wheat is mostly consumed in urban areas, and it can be considered a food that is consumed by people who have some capacity to buy it, some financial capacity to buy it. So I don't think this variety in prices might have affected, at least in rural areas, as much. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, I mean, that was a comment. Yeah, I mean, so I should say over to you, maybe Gita. So yeah, you can conclude. Plus, also you're doing nutritional stuff, so maybe, and Julie, maybe you can respond whether you think that this impact.
I think it's thank you, Naila. I think it's a reasonable assumption that since the wheat is not as such very much important food item in the consumption items of the poor, and then any price effect on price wheat might not have implication on nutrition and all these things. But it might also be important to look at, for example, red meat price has been affected by the crisis, and then that might have implication on the amount of protein they are generating, and also the food diets and all these things. Yeah, I think it's also good to see whether that have implication on nutrition because of different effect on different commodities. That's what Greenwell was saying, that it's a heterogeneous effect. For some commodities it may not be that much significant, but some, especially for high protein commodities, it might be very significant, and that might have implication on nutrition. And thank you. I think all these informations are important. And also Greenwell, probably we don't have time. I mean, we are already remained with 1 minute. So we have to wind up here. And then if there is no any urgent or any burning issue anymore, is there any hand? No, I can't see from my side.
Oh, we don't have any more hands.
Yeah, we don't have any more hand. We would have discussed more about also the policy responses that Mozambique is doing in terms of producing wheat locally and all this, which has become a widespread policy response across African countries. Many African countries are trying to produce locally some of the strategic commodities like wheat and rice in West Africa, and some wheat in Eastern Africa as well. So what will be the implication of these policy responses on the markets and long-term trades and all these things? Those are issues to be discussed, and those are important implications for policies, so that policies can learn from their mistakes. So the final conclusion, the most important one is where we don't need to panic and then go for export restrictions and all these things. So those are important implications, because it might disturb even the local markets, not only the regional market, but also the local markets. So those are important implications from the study. And with this, I thank you everybody for coming and attending and for your active participation. I also thank you, Dr. Greenwell Machaya, for your nice presentation and for your responses. And thank you, everybody. And with this remark, I hand over to Lai. Lai, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, Dr. Getao Tadase, for managing this session beautifully. And thank you again to our presenter, Dr. Greenwell Machaya. I'm sure we're going to have you again for another couple of sessions, since you are one of the contributing authors to this series. Special thank you to all our attendees. Thank you for yet another engaging and rich session. Your inputs are always welcome. Don't stop here. Please head to academia2063.org, visit our Ukraine crisis portal, and delve into the briefs that we have published so far. We have 23 and counting. We would like to hear from you. We take a break next week to come back on March 28th. For session 13, where we will discuss the impact on commodity markets in Uganda, this time with Dr. Paul Guthiga. Thank you again for coming, and see you next time. Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye.